People usually imagine that the worst day of a man's life looks dramatic. Mine didn't. There were no police officers waiting outside the building, no shouting, no broken furniture, no headlines, just a cardboard box resting in my hands. Inside, it were 23 years of work reduced to a few meaningless objects. A coffee mug with a faded company logo, a framed photograph of my wife smiling beside me on a quiet Sunday morning, a notebook whose pages were filled with ideas that would never belong to me again, and a pen someone had once given me after my 10th anniversary with the company. I remember staring at that pen longer than I should have. It was strange how something so small could suddenly feel heavier than everything else. People walked past me toward the parking lot. Some avoided my eyes. Others looked for only a second before pretending they hadn't seen me. A few months earlier, many of those same people had asked for my advice almost every day. Now they acted as though standing too close to me might infect them with the same fate. I didn't blame them. Fear has always spread faster than truth. The glass doors behind me opened one last time. For a brief moment, I thought someone had come after me. Maybe human resources had forgotten another document. Maybe one of the engineers wanted to shake my hand. Maybe someone would simply say, "This isn't right." Instead, a young employee hurried past without even noticing I was there. The doors closed again. The building reflected my own tired face back at me. I barely recognized the man looking back. The wrinkles hadn't appeared overnight. Neither had the gray in my hair. Those things had arrived one difficult year at a time. What surprised me wasn't how old I looked. It was how peaceful I still felt. Not happy, not victorious, just strangely calm. Because by then, there was nothing left for them to take. My reputation was already gone. My position was gone. Most of my friends inside that building had quietly disappeared long before I walked out of it. The only thing I still owned was the ability to tell myself I had never become the kind of man they wanted me to be. I picked up the cardboard box again. The parking lot seemed much larger than I remembered. Every step echoed louder than it should have. And as I reached my old car, only one question kept repeating inside my head. How had everything fallen apart when all I had ever tried to do was the right thing? 3 years earlier. Back then, my mornings began before sunrise. Not because anyone expected me to, because I liked having a few quiet minutes before the world became noisy. I'd brew a cup of black coffee, review the list I'd written the night before, and leave the apartment while most of the city was still asleep. Those drives to work became my favorite part of every weekday. No traffic, no phone calls. Just enough silence to prepare myself for whatever problems waited at the office. I wasn't rich. I wasn't ambitious in the way people usually meant. I didn't dream about becoming a CEO. I didn't spend my evenings imagining corner offices or expensive watches. What I wanted was surprisingly ordinary. A stable job, a peaceful home. Enough money that my wife would never have to worry when unexpected bills arrived. That was success to me. The company wasn't perfect. No company is. But it had something I respected. People solved problems instead of searching for someone to blame. Departments argued because they cared about finding better answers, not because they wanted political victories. When mistakes happened, we fixed them. Then we moved on. I believed I had found the kind of place where honest work actually mattered. Looking back now, I realize how fortunate ignorance can feel. You don't notice the ground beneath you until it starts to crack. I wasn't the smartest employee in the building. There were engineers with deeper technical knowledge, managers with longer resumes, analysts who could process numbers faster than I ever could. What made people come to my desk wasn't genius. It was reliability. If someone brought me a problem, I stayed with it until it was solved. Not because I wanted recognition, because unfinished work followed me home. I hated that feeling. One Tuesday morning, two departments spent nearly an hour arguing over a production delay. Each insisted the other had created the bottleneck. Voices became louder. Meetings multiplied. Emails grew longer. Nothing improved. Eventually, someone walked over to my desk. "Can you take a look?" I nodded. Within 30 minutes, the answer became obvious. Neither department had caused the delay. Both had been working from different versions of the same operating schedule. One outdated spreadsheet. Dozens of wasted hours, thousands of dollars quietly disappearing. I corrected the schedule, gathered both supervisors, and walked them through the mistake. No speeches, no embarrassment, no winners. By lunchtime, production was moving normally again. One supervisor laughed and slapped my shoulder. "I don't know how you keep doing this." I smiled. "I just start with the problem." People often think solving problems begins with intelligence. Most of the time, it begins with listening long enough to understand what everyone else is too busy arguing to notice. As everyone returned to work, I didn't realize someone had been watching the entire conversation from the glass office, overlooking the production floor. I wouldn't learn his name until later, and I certainly had no idea. That simple 30-minute conversation had just changed the direction of my life forever. I found out later that the man behind the glass office was Arthur Whitmore, the founder of the company. Unlike most executives, he rarely interrupted meetings to make speeches. He preferred watching, listening, measuring people long before introducing himself. That afternoon, my manager stopped beside my desk. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you." For a moment, I thought I'd made a mistake. Founders didn't normally summon mid-level employees, certainly not me. I straightened my shirt before walking upstairs. His office was surprisingly plain. No oversized desk, no expensive artwork trying to impress visitors. Just organized shelves, a worn leather notebook, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the production floor. He didn't ask me to sit immediately. Instead, he looked outside for several seconds. "You solved that scheduling issue." "Yes, sir." "You didn't tell either department whose fault it was?" There wasn't much point. He turned toward me. "Why?" "Because tomorrow, they'll still have to work together." For the first time, he smiled. Not broadly, just enough to show he'd heard the answer he was hoping for. Most people believed leadership was about finding the smartest employee. Arthur Whitmore seemed more interested in finding the safest pair of hands. He asked about my work, my family, how long I'd been with the company. Then he closed his notebook. "Competence can be taught," he said quietly. "Character usually can't." Those words stayed with me long after I left his office. Over the following months, he occasionally asked for my opinion on projects outside my department. Nothing glamorous, nothing public, just problems that needed someone more interested in solutions than credit. I never realized those conversations were building something much larger than professional trust. Every evening, no matter how exhausting work became, the moment I opened the apartment door, the weight of the office seemed to disappear. My wife, Claire, had a habit of greeting me with the same smile, whether I'd had the best day of my career or the worst. "You look hungry?" she said one evening before I could even take off my shoes. "I always look hungry." She laughed. "That's true." The apartment wasn't large. The dining table barely fit 4 people. The kitchen was small enough that we constantly bumped into each other while cooking. But somehow, it always felt bigger than any house I'd ever lived in. Because peace has a way of making small places feel spacious. Dinner became our favorite ritual. No phones, no television, just conversation. She told me about the children she'd helped at the community library. I told her about impossible deadlines, strange customer requests, and coworkers who argued over problems that could have been solved by simply talking to one another. She listened as though every story mattered. Sometimes she disagreed with me. Sometimes she challenged my thinking, but she always made me feel understood. One evening, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You've been working harder lately?" "A little." "Too hard?" I thought about it. "Maybe." She smiled gently. "Just don't forget why you're doing it." I looked around our tiny apartment. The second-hand sofa. The old bookshelf we'd assembled together after arguing over the instructions for nearly an hour. The framed wedding photograph hanging slightly crooked because neither of us could hammer a nail straight. "I won't," I said. At the time, I believed I was protecting our future. I had no idea how much of that future would eventually depend on surviving people I hadn't even noticed yet. There was one person who had noticed me. I simply hadn't noticed him. Julian Ashcroft, the founder's only son. Officially, he was being prepared to inherit the company. On paper, his resume looked impressive. Top business school, international internships, executive development programs. Nobody questioned whether he was intelligent. The problem wasn't intelligence. It was comparison. Every time Arthur Whitmore publicly thanked another employee, Julian's expression changed ever so slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for someone paying attention. One afternoon, I happened to pass the executive corridor while Arthur congratulated me for leading a successful process improvement project. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. I thanked him. He returned to his office. I went back downstairs. Completely ordinary. At least, for me. As I rounded the corner, I saw Julian standing alone near the windows. Our eyes met. He smiled. Friendly. Professional. Almost effortless. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you. I've been hearing your name a lot lately." I laughed awkwardly. "I guess I've just been lucky." His smile never disappeared. I don't believe in luck. For reasons I couldn't explain, the hallway suddenly felt colder. The conversation ended politely. Nothing threatening had been said. Nothing openly hostile had happened. Yet as I walked away, I found myself replaying those few seconds over and over without understanding why. Several weeks later, Arthur called me into his office once again. "I'd like you to oversee a cross-department improvement initiative." I stared at him. "Sir, there are managers more qualified than I am." "There are managers with more authority," he corrected. "That isn't the same thing." He slid a thin folder across the desk. "I trust your judgment." Simple words, but they carried enormous weight. I accepted the folder with both hands. "I won't let you down." "I know." When I stepped outside, I felt grateful. Nothing more. I never imagined that the same promotion I saw as responsibility, someone else would see as a threat. From the opposite end of the corridor, Julian watched me leave Arthur's office carrying the folder. He didn't know what had been discussed. He didn't need to. In his mind, another piece had quietly moved across the board. The company continued exactly as it always had. Meetings filled calendars. Machines continued running. Employees joked over coffee. Deadlines came and went. Everything looked unchanged. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had already begun. I believed I had earned trust. Julian believed he had found a rival. Neither Arthur nor I realized that, from that day forward, every success of mine would become another reason for someone else to resent me. And that was how a story built on integrity first became a story about survival. The promotion didn't change the way I worked. If anything, it simply gave more people permission to bring me their problems. Every morning, there was another department asking if I had a few minutes. A delayed shipment, a supplier dispute, an inventory mismatch, a production schedule that no longer made sense. I never asked why they came to me instead of their own managers. I simply assumed they trusted me enough to help. Whenever something was solved, I returned to my desk before anyone had time to congratulate me. There was always another problem waiting. One afternoon, Arthur Whitmore stopped beside my workstation while everyone else was busy preparing for the weekly operations meeting. "I've been hearing good things again," he said. "I've just been doing my job." He smiled. "That's exactly why people keep talking about you." Before walking away, he placed another project folder on my desk. "It needs someone who cares more about getting it right than getting credit." After he left, several co-workers looked toward my desk. Most smiled. Some nodded with quiet respect. I felt grateful. Across the office, Julian noticed the same moment. He didn't hear the conversation. He didn't need to. The folder in my hands told him everything he believed he needed to know. For the first time, he began realizing my influence wasn't slowing down. It was growing. A week later, I arrived early to prepare a presentation for the executive review. The files I'd finished the previous evening were gone. At first, I assumed I'd saved them in the wrong directory. I searched every folder. Nothing. I checked the backup server. Still nothing. The meeting was less than 2 hours away. For the first time in months, panic tried to creep into my thoughts. Then I forced myself to stop. Panic had never solved a single problem. I reopened my notes and started rebuilding the presentation from memory. Several co-workers noticed. "What happened?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Maybe I made a mistake." By the time the meeting began, the presentation was finished again. Not perfect, but complete. The review went smoothly. No one complained. No one questioned why I looked more exhausted than usual. Later that afternoon, I walked past the IT office. One technician frowned at his monitor. "That's strange." "What is?" He hesitated. "Nothing." He clicked his mouse a few more times before shaking his head. "The access logs don't make sense." I didn't think much of it. Computer systems occasionally behaved strangely. There was always a reasonable explanation. From the opposite end of the hallway, Julian watched me continue walking without ever looking back. A faint smile crossed his face, small enough that no one else would have noticed. The first obstacle had worked exactly as intended. Not because it damaged my work, because it stole something far more valuable: time, energy, confidence. And I still believed it had all been an accident. Ironically, the setback only made me work harder. Over the following days, I reviewed every process twice before submitting it. I checked reports more carefully, stayed later, asked more questions. If there was a weakness somewhere, I wanted to find it before it became another problem. Eventually, another operational issue surfaced, this time involving conflicting purchase orders between procurement and manufacturing. The disagreement had already delayed production. Managers gathered in another conference room. Voices slowly became louder. I listened for nearly 20 minutes before asking a single question. Has anyone compared both departments against the supplier's original confirmation? Silence. Within minutes, the answer became obvious. The supplier had updated delivery quantities 3 days earlier. Only one department had received the revised confirmation. No one had intentionally made a mistake. They had simply been working with different information. The tension disappeared almost immediately. Someone laughed. Another manager sighed with relief. As everyone stood to leave, Arthur looked toward me. "Good work." I nodded. "It was a team effort." He smiled again. "You always say that." I wasn't trying to be modest. It was simply true. Problems rarely belong to one person. Neither did solutions. As I left the conference room, several employees thanked me for preventing another costly delay. Their appreciation felt encouraging. But I failed to notice the one pair of eyes watching from behind the glass wall. Every compliment directed toward me became another quiet reminder to Julian that his father's confidence was drifting somewhere he believed it should never go. The following Monday, Arthur invited department heads into the main conference room for the monthly operational review. I attended only because the improvement project had become part of the agenda. When my section ended, I gathered my papers, expecting the meeting to move on. Instead, Arthur remained standing. "Before we continue," he said, looking around the room, "I'd like to acknowledge the work that's been done over the past several months." The room grew quiet. "The efficiency improvements we've seen aren't the result of one department." He paused. "But they've been consistently driven by one person who's been willing to solve problems outside his own responsibilities." Then he looked directly at me. "Thank you." A few people applauded. I felt my face grow warm. "It wasn't just me," I replied. "A lot of people contributed." "I know," Arthur answered. "That's one of the reasons I'm thanking you." The applause ended, and the meeting continued. To everyone else, it was a brief moment of appreciation. To Julian, it was something else entirely. He sat through the rest of the meeting without saying much. His expression never changed, but beneath that calm silence, something had shifted. Recognition had stopped feeling like professional feedback. It had become personal humiliation, and humiliation has a way of convincing people that fairness is an obstacle instead of a principle. Not long afterward, small things began changing around the office. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone could report to human resources. Conversations stopped when I entered the break room. Co-workers who used to ask for my opinion suddenly seemed hesitant. Some smiled less. Others became strangely formal. At first, I assumed everyone was simply busy. Then I started hearing fragments. "Close to the founder," "fast promotions," "favorites always get opportunities." No one ever said those words to my face. No one accused me of anything directly. The rumors drifted through hallways like cigarette smoke. Impossible to catch. Impossible to prove. One afternoon, I asked a colleague if everything was all right. He forced a smile. "Of course." "You've seemed distant lately." "No. Just a lot on my mind." The conversation ended there. Not because either of us wanted it to, because an invisible wall had quietly appeared between us. I still believed honesty would clear up any misunderstanding. I didn't realize honesty has very little power against accusations that are never spoken aloud. Weeks passed. The atmosphere inside the company slowly became unfamiliar. People still worked together, still attended meetings, still exchanged polite greetings. But something essential had disappeared. Trust no longer flowed naturally. Employees measured every sentence before speaking. Some avoided taking sides. Others avoided being seen beside me altogether. One engineer who used to eat lunch with me almost every day walked past my table carrying his tray. For a second, I thought he hadn't seen me. Then our eyes met. He gave an apologetic nod and sat somewhere else. It wasn't rejection. It was fear. And somehow, that hurt even more, because fear doesn't need instructions. Once it settles into a workplace, people begin protecting themselves without anyone having to tell them how. Julian rarely confronted me directly anymore. He didn't have to. The atmosphere itself had begun doing his work for him. For the first time since joining the company, I found myself excluded from a planning discussion I had helped create months earlier. No explanation, no argument, just silence. I told myself not to take it personally, to stay focused, to keep doing the work. Surely good work would eventually speak for itself. I had no idea the rules of the game had already changed. That evening, I arrived home later than usual. Claire was already setting dinner on the table. She looked up the moment I walked through the door. "You've been working too much." I smiled, trying to sound convincing. "It's just a busy season." She studied my face for a moment longer than usual. "You're tired." "I'll be fine." During dinner, I caught myself staring at my plate more than speaking. Claire reached across the table and rested her hand over mine. Did something happen? I wanted to tell her everything. That work felt different. That people I'd trusted no longer looked at me the same way. That I couldn't explain why every day seemed slightly heavier than the one before. Instead, I shook my head. Just a few challenges. We've handled challenges before. I know. And we'll handle these too. Her confidence made me smile. For a little while, it even made me believe her. After she went to bed, I remained alone in the living room with my notebook open. I rewrote tomorrow's task list. Double-check every report. Arrive earlier. Work harder. Solve problems faster. I convinced myself the answer was simple. If I became even more dependable, everything would return to normal. Outside the apartment window, the city slowly fell asleep. Inside the company I'd grown to love, something far more dangerous was quietly waking up. The first project that truly belonged to me was supposed to improve communication between 4 departments. Nothing revolutionary. Just a system that would reduce delays, eliminate duplicate reports, and give every team access to the same information. For months, people had complained about the existing process. When Arthur approved the proposal, I believed we finally had a chance to fix it. The first planning meeting went well. Every department agreed on the objectives. Everyone promised their cooperation. I left the room convinced the hardest part was already behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. The following week, the procurement team postponed their review because a manager had become unexpectedly unavailable. A day later, finance requested additional documentation that had never been required before. Operations missed 2 consecutive meetings without explanation. Then legal insisted on reviewing procedures they had already approved. Each delay seemed reasonable on its own. No single incident looked suspicious. But together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Instead of building the project, I spent my days rescheduling meetings, rewriting documents, and answering the same questions over and over again. One afternoon, I looked at the project timeline pinned beside my desk. Every milestone had been pushed back. Not because the work was difficult, because the work was no longer being allowed to move forward. For the first time, I caught myself wondering whether someone actually wanted this project to fail. I dismissed the thought almost immediately. No, that couldn't be it. Companies don't sabotage themselves. People don't make their own jobs harder on purpose. At least, that was still what I believed. The office had become quieter. Not literally. Printers still hummed. Phones still rang. Meetings continued as usual. But the conversations that once filled the spaces between work had almost disappeared. When I walked into the break room, voices often stopped for just a second. Long enough for everyone to notice. Too short for anyone to acknowledge. Someone would quickly change the subject. Another person would suddenly remember they needed to return to their desk. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Stress has a way of making ordinary moments feel personal, but the pattern repeated itself too often. One afternoon, I found two supervisors discussing next quarter's workflow. The moment they saw me, both fell silent. "Sorry," one of them said awkwardly. "We'll finish this later." They walked away together. I remained standing there holding my coffee, trying to convince myself it wasn't about me. What hurt wasn't the silence itself. It was the realization that nobody seemed willing to break it. People who had once challenged my ideas openly now avoided simple conversations. Those who still respected me did so from a distance. No one criticized me. No one defended me. Fear had created a strange kind of neutrality. And neutrality, I was beginning to learn, always benefits the person creating the fear. The project eventually reached Arthur's desk. Despite every delay, the early results were promising. The pilot department reported faster turnaround times. Communication errors had dropped. Productivity had improved. The numbers spoke for themselves. Arthur reviewed the report quietly before looking at me. "Good work." "Thank you, sir. I'd like to expand this company-wide." I nodded. "I'll start preparing the next phase." As I left his office, I expected to feel encouraged. Instead, I felt tired, because I already knew what expanding the project would mean. More resistance, more unexplained delays, more obstacles that no report could ever measure. Over the next several weeks, exactly that happened. Recommendations supported by clear data were ignored. Meetings ended with decisions being postponed indefinitely. Ideas were evaluated less by their results than by who presented them. For the first time in my career, I realized something that deeply unsettled me. Performance wasn't losing because it was weak. Performance was losing because it no longer mattered. Politics had quietly become more valuable than competence. I sat alone at my desk after everyone else had gone home, staring at the latest progress report. The evidence was undeniable. We were succeeding whenever people allowed the work to happen. We were failing whenever pride entered the room. I closed the report and placed it carefully inside my drawer. I couldn't control how other people chose to behave. I couldn't force honesty. I couldn't demand fairness. The only decision that still belonged entirely to me was whether I would become like them. I chose my answer before I stood up. Whatever this place was becoming, I would not let it decide who I became. A few days later, Arthur asked me to stop by his office. Normally, those conversations were straightforward. We discussed projects, problems, ideas. This time felt different before either of us spoke. He remained unusually quiet as he read through several reports spread across his desk. Finally, he removed his glasses and looked at me. "I've been hearing different opinions lately." I waited. "They don't match what I've personally seen." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he continued. "Some managers believe you're becoming difficult to work with." The words didn't hurt because I believed them. They hurt because they came from him. For the first time since I'd joined the company, Arthur Whitmore wasn't speaking from certainty. He was speaking from doubt. "I see," I answered calmly. He studied my face, perhaps expecting an explanation. I could have defended myself, listed every completed project, explained every delay, named every meeting that had been quietly obstructed. Instead, I simply asked, "Have I failed to deliver the work you've assigned me?" He looked back at the reports. "No." "Then I'll keep doing it." A faint smile appeared on his face, though it carried none of its usual warmth. "I hope you're right." As I left his office, I realized something had changed. Not his trust, not yet, But certainty had been replaced by questions, and once doubt enters a relationship, it rarely leaves on its own. Work no longer stayed at the office. It came home with me, not in briefcases or laptops. It arrived in silence. Claire noticed it before I did. One evening, she placed dinner on the table and waited until we had both finished eating before speaking. "You've hardly said 10 words tonight." I looked up. "Sorry. You've been apologizing a lot lately." I forced a smile. "Long week." She nodded slowly. "It feels like every week is becoming a long week." I wanted to tell her everything. How every conversation at work now felt measured. How every meeting seemed heavier than the last. How I spent more time proving my honesty than doing my actual job. Instead, I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It'll pass." She smiled back. "I hope so." So did I. But hope had started sounding less like confidence and more like a prayer. That night, I opened the budgeting notebook we updated every month. Nothing alarming had happened yet. The bills were paid. Our savings were still intact. Yet I found myself calculating expenses more carefully than before. Not because money had become a problem, because uncertainty had. A few nights later, Claire found me sitting alone on the balcony after midnight. She wrapped a blanket around my shoulders before sitting beside me. Neither of us spoke immediately. The city below was unusually quiet. Finally, she asked, "Have you ever thought about looking somewhere else?" The question surprised me. "You mean another company?" She nodded. "If this place is making you miserable." I stared at the lights stretching across the horizon. "I don't think it's the company." "Then what is it?" I searched for an answer I could explain. I paused. "I think something inside the company is changing." She rested her head against my shoulder. "You don't have to carry everything alone." "I know. You can tell me." "I don't even know how to explain it." She remained silent, not because she had given up, because she understood some battles cannot be described while they're still happening. After a while, she spoke again. "Whatever happens, don't let them change who you are." She meant those words as comfort. I accepted them that way. Neither of us realized they would become the hardest advice I'd ever try to follow. The weeks that followed stripped away the last illusion I had been holding on to. I stopped expecting meetings to be fair, stopped expecting rumors to disappear, stopped believing that doing excellent work would automatically correct false perceptions. None of those things happened, yet something else did. Every morning, I still arrived before most of the building. I still greeted the security guards by name. I still answered questions from junior employees. I still reviewed reports as carefully as I always had. Not because I believed those actions would save my career, because they defined the kind of man I wanted to remain. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the dark window outside the conference room. Months earlier, I had seen an employee climbing toward greater responsibility. Now, I saw someone standing almost alone. The respect that once surrounded me had become cautious distance. The friendships I once relied on had dissolved into polite conversations. The confidence I'd carried so naturally had been replaced by something quieter. Conviction. I finally understood what this fight was becoming. I was no longer struggling to protect my position, or my promotion, or even my reputation. I was fighting to protect the one thing no organization had the right to take from me: my integrity. If I lost everything else but kept that, then I hadn't truly lost. And if keeping it meant standing alone, then standing alone would simply become part of the price. I straightened my tie, picked up the project folder from my desk, and walked toward another meeting where I already knew the outcome might be decided before I entered the room. Even so, I walked in with my head held high, because I had finally accepted a truth that frightened me more than unemployment ever could. The hardest part of surviving a corrupt workplace is making sure its corruption never survives inside you. I used to believe people formed opinions after meeting someone. Now, I watched them form opinions before I had spoken a single word. It started in small ways. A proposal I submitted would receive skeptical questions before anyone opened the first page. Suggestions that once sparked discussion were now met with polite silence. Managers who had previously invited me into planning sessions suddenly preferred sending emails instead of speaking face to face. Nothing was openly hostile. No one accused me of incompetence. Yet I could feel something changing every time I entered a room. The conclusion had already been made. The meeting was only there to justify it. One morning, I introduced myself to a new department supervisor. Before I had finished my sentence, he smiled awkwardly. "Oh, I've heard about you." There was nothing openly insulting in his voice, but something inside me tightened. He hadn't said he'd met me. He hadn't said he'd worked with me, only that he'd heard about me. Somewhere inside the company, my reputation had started arriving before I did. I wanted to ask what he'd heard. Instead, I smiled and continued the meeting as professionally as I could. Defending myself against stories I couldn't hear felt impossible. So I stopped trying. I decided the only thing I could still control was the way I carried myself. If people expected bitterness, they wouldn't find it in me. The quarterly strategy meeting gathered nearly every department head in one room. I presented an update on the improvement initiative. The data was clear. Processing times had improved wherever the new procedures had actually been implemented. Before I could continue, Julian leaned forward. "Those numbers don't reflect the concerns I've been hearing." The room became quiet. "What concerns?" I asked. He shrugged. "Several managers have questioned whether your methods create unnecessary disruption." I looked around the table. There were people in that room who had worked beside me for years. People who knew exactly how carefully every recommendation had been prepared. People who privately thanked me whenever a difficult project succeeded. No one spoke. One manager lowered his eyes toward the documents in front of him. Another slowly turned the pages of his notebook without reading them. Someone cleared his throat. Then, nothing. The silence lasted only a few seconds. It felt much longer. I realized they weren't agreeing with Julian. They were protecting themselves. Fear had become more persuasive than truth. I answered every question calmly, explained every decision with supporting evidence. No one challenged the facts. Yet when the meeting ended, I knew I hadn't won anything. Facts no longer decided outcomes. Atmosphere did. As everyone left the conference room, one senior engineer quietly brushed past me. Without looking up, he whispered, "You were right." Then he kept walking. It was the smallest sentence anyone had spoken all day. Oddly enough, it was also the one that hurt the most. Because even the people who believed me no longer believed they could stand beside me. Arthur called me into his office later that afternoon. Months earlier, I would have entered with confidence. Now I entered wondering which version of me had reached him first. The one he had known for years, or the one rumors had slowly constructed. He stood beside the window instead of behind his desk. "I've received more complaints." "I understand." He turned toward me. "I'm trying to see the full picture." "I know." His eyes searched mine, as though hoping certainty would return if he looked long enough. "I don't want this company divided." "Neither do I." He nodded slowly. Then came a pause that neither of us knew how to cross. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was hesitation. the kind that quietly grows when trust begins competing with doubt. Months ago, Arthur would have asked, "What really happened?" Today, he simply accepted that something must have happened. That difference broke my heart more than any accusation ever could. "I'll continue doing my job," I said. "I know you will." But the confidence that once lived inside those words was gone. When I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. He didn't offer encouragement. He didn't remind me that he believed in me. He simply watched me walk toward the door. As my hand reached the handle, I realized I no longer knew whether my greatest mentor still saw the man he had once trusted, or the man everyone else had slowly convinced him to question. For the first time since joining the company, I walked out of Arthur Whitmore's office carrying uncertainty instead of hope. The first consequence didn't arrive with a termination letter. It arrived with numbers. On the last Friday of the month, I sat at our small dining table with a calculator, a notebook, and a stack of bills. Claire quietly placed 2 cups of tea beside me before sitting across the table. Neither of us spoke immediately. I reviewed our budget again, the reduced performance bonus, an unexpected repair for the car, higher medical expenses for Claire after weeks of recurring migraines brought on by stress. Individually, none of them were disastrous. Together, they quietly erased the sense of security we had spent years building. I crossed out one expense after another. "We can postpone replacing the washing machine," I said. Claire nodded. "And the vacation?" I smiled gently. "Next year." She looked down at the notebook. "You've been saying next year about a lot of things." There was no accusation in her voice, only sadness. I reached across the table and closed the notebook. "We'll be all right." She wanted to believe me. I wanted to believe myself. But confidence had become expensive. Every setback at work now found its way into our home. Not because we were careless, because injustice always sends the bill somewhere. And more often than not, it sends it to the people who never caused it. The apartment still felt peaceful, but peace no longer felt effortless. I noticed it in the evenings. Claire would ask how my day had been. I'd answer, "Busy." She would nod. Then we'd both pretend that one word was enough to describe everything neither of us knew how to explain. One rainy night, the electricity briefly flickered. The room fell silent, except for the rain tapping against the windows. Claire leaned against me on the sofa. "We're okay, aren't we?" The question caught me off guard. I looked at her. "We are." "You don't sound sure." I searched for the right words. "I'm sure about us. But I'm not sure how long I can keep bringing this version of myself home." She took my hand. "You don't have to be strong every minute." I laughed softly. "I know." But I wasn't certain I actually did know. For months, I had convinced myself that protecting Claire meant hiding my burden. Now I wondered if all I had really done was carry it until there was no room left for anything else. We still loved each other. That had never changed. What had changed was how exhausted love had become. Sometimes affection isn't enough to remove pain. Sometimes all it can do is sit quietly beside it. That night, we fell asleep holding hands, not because either of us had found an answer, but because neither of us wanted the other to feel alone. Several days later, I stayed at the office long after everyone had gone home. The building echoed differently when it was empty. Without conversations and ringing phones, every thought seemed louder. I opened the drawer containing months of reports, successful projects, performance reviews, letters of appreciation. Objective proof that I had done my job well. I looked at them for a long time. Then a question entered my mind that I had spent months refusing to entertain. What if they're right? The thought lasted only a heartbeat. Even so, It frightened me, not because I believed it, because I had allowed it to exist. What if integrity really wasn't enough? What if honesty only guaranteed becoming a target? What if all these years I'd confused principle with naivety? I closed my eyes, ashamed. Those questions weren't born from ambition. They were born from exhaustion. I understood the difference. Slowly, I gathered every report back into its folder. No document could prove my character. No performance review could protect my conscience. If integrity only mattered when life was easy, then it wasn't integrity at all. It was convenience. When I stood up from my chair, the questions hadn't disappeared, but neither had my answer. I would rather suffer for doing what was right than succeed by becoming someone I no longer respected. That night, I returned home after midnight. Claire was already asleep. The apartment was completely still. I changed quietly, poured myself a glass of water, and sat alone near the window overlooking the city. The lights below stretched endlessly into the darkness. Each apartment held lives I knew nothing about, people celebrating, people grieving, people beginning again. For a long time, I simply watched. No television, no music, no distractions, only silence. For the first time in many months, I stopped thinking about Julian, stopped thinking about rumors, stopped thinking about meetings. Instead, I asked myself a far more difficult question. When everything else has been stripped away, who am I? The answer didn't come quickly. It arrived in pieces. I was still the man who greeted the security guards every morning. Still the husband who wanted Claire to feel safe. Still the employee who believed work should be done honestly, even when no one noticed. They had taken my reputation. They had shaken my confidence. They had weakened the trust of people I admired. But one thing remained untouched: the choice I would make tomorrow morning. I could still decide what kind of man walked through those company doors. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel hopeful. I simply felt tired. The kind of tiredness that settles into your bones after fighting a battle no one else can see. Outside, dawn was still hours away. Inside, something quiet but stubborn refused to disappear. Not confidence, not optimism. Something deeper. The belief that even if the world refused to reward integrity, integrity was still worth keeping. I sat there until the first faint light appeared beyond the buildings. Then I stood, straightened my shirt, and prepared for another day. Not because I believed the day would be easier, but because surrender was becoming easier. And that was exactly why I refused to do it. The call came just after 9 on a Tuesday morning. "Arthur wants to see you." The receptionist's voice was polite, almost apologetic. As I walked toward the executive floor, I noticed something unusual. People looked at me, then quickly looked away. By then, I understood what that meant. News had already traveled. I simply hadn't heard it yet. Arthur's office door was open. He remained standing beside the window, his back turned toward me. Julian sat quietly across the room with several folders neatly arranged on the table. The atmosphere felt less like a meeting and more like a verdict. Arthur finally turned. "There have been additional complaints." I nodded. I assumed there would be. Julian slid one of the folders across the table. "We've documented repeated concerns from multiple departments." I opened it. Anonymous statements, unsigned summaries, conclusions with no identifiable sources. None of them described measurable failures. Only impressions. Difficult to collaborate with? Creates unnecessary tension. Insists on doing things his own way. Each sentence was vague enough to avoid being disproven. Together, they painted a picture of someone I barely recognized. Arthur spoke carefully. "I'm not saying I believe all of this, but I can't ignore it anymore. For a long moment, I stared at the pages. Months ago, I would have defended myself, presented evidence, explained every delayed project, named every successful outcome. Instead, I quietly closed the folder. I understand. Julian looked almost disappointed. Perhaps he had expected anger or desperation. Instead, there was only exhaustion. Arthur folded his hands. Until we sort this out, he paused. I'm removing you from leadership of the Improvement Initiative. The words landed softly. Their weight did not. That project had represented years of work. Not because it belonged to me, because it belonged to the company I had believed we were trying to build. I nodded once. If that's your decision, it is. I stood. Then, I'll support whoever takes over. Neither Arthur nor Julian expected that answer. I walked out carrying nothing except a notebook that suddenly felt much heavier than it had that morning. For the first time since joining the company, I no longer had anyone left inside the organization, standing between me and the storm. That evening, I arrived home earlier than usual. Claire immediately noticed. You're home. I am. She smiled at first. Then she saw my face. Something inside her expression changed. She quietly turned off the stove and walked toward me. What happened? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. For months, I had answered every difficult question with the same sentence. I'm fine. This time, I couldn't. Claire gently placed both hands around mine. You don't have to protect me anymore. Those words broke something inside me. I sat down at the dining table without taking off my jacket. They removed me from the project. She remained silent. They don't trust me anymore. Still, she said nothing. Not because she didn't care, because she knew I wasn't finished. I kept thinking. I laughed bitterly. If I just worked harder, if I stayed patient, if I refused to become angry, eventually everything would make sense. I looked down at the table. It never did. Claire pulled out the chair beside me. For the first time in months, we stopped pretending. I've been scared, she admitted quietly. So have I. I didn't tell you because I thought you needed someone strong. I didn't tell you because I thought I had to be that someone. Neither of us cried immediately. We simply sat there. Two people who loved each other enough to stop hiding from the truth. Nothing had improved. The bills still waited. My reputation was still damaged. Tomorrow morning I would return to the same office. Yet somehow, the room felt lighter. Not because the burden had become smaller, because it was finally being carried by two people instead of one. Several nights later, I couldn't sleep. I left the bedroom without waking Claire and walked to the balcony. The city stretched endlessly beneath the darkness. Somewhere below, thousands of people were ending ordinary days. Mine no longer felt ordinary. I leaned against the railing and asked myself the one question I had avoided for nearly a year. If no one ever believes me, will I still choose to be this man? There was no one there to answer. Not Arthur. Not Claire. Not a friend. Not even God seemed to interrupt the silence. Only me. For the first time, I admitted something I had been too ashamed to confess. I wanted justice. I wanted someone to finally say, "We were wrong about you." I wanted my name back. There was nothing sinful about wanting those things. But another question quietly followed. And if they never come? The silence grew even deeper. I closed my eyes. That was the question. No one else could answer for me. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a long time, I simply sat at the edge of the bed while Claire continued sleeping peacefully beside me. I realized something that surprised even me. Nothing had changed. I still wasn't leading the project. The rumors still existed. The company was still becoming a place I barely recognized. Yet somewhere during the night, my heart had stopped negotiating. I had spent months telling myself, I'll keep my integrity until fairness returns. Without realizing it, I had made integrity conditional. That morning, I quietly removed the condition. I would tell the truth, even if no one thanked me. I would work honestly, even if someone else received the credit. I would remain the same man, even if history remembered me incorrectly. Not because those choices guaranteed victory, but because they defined who I refused to stop becoming. No audience witnessed that decision. No applause followed. No music announced a turning point. Claire never knew what had happened while she slept. Neither did anyone at the company. But the most important battle of my life ended there, in complete silence. And although the world outside that bedroom looked exactly the same, I was no longer the man who had gone to sleep the night before. The company didn't change overnight. Neither did the people inside it. Rumors still floated through the hallways. Meetings still carried the same uncomfortable silence. Julian still walked through the office with the confidence of someone who believed the battle had already been won. Only one thing was different. It wasn't the company. It was me. For the first time in nearly a year, I stopped measuring every day by whether people believed me. I measured it by one question instead. Did I act according to the man I decided to become? If the answer was yes, the day had not been wasted. A week later, the first unexpected crack appeared. It happened during a routine budget review. Finance couldn't reconcile several approval records from previous quarters. Nothing dramatic. Just a handful of documents carrying inconsistent dates and conflicting authorization signatures. The accounting supervisor frowned. That shouldn't happen. Someone suggested it was probably an administrative mistake. The meeting continued. No investigation followed. Yet the question lingered. A few days later, procurement discovered purchase orders that had been revised without complete documentation. Again, nothing conclusive, nothing scandalous, just another small inconsistency. One manager quietly remarked, "That's the second time this month." No one answered. For months, corruption had depended on everyone believing that confusion was normal. Now, confusion itself had begun attracting attention. No one accused Julian. No one defended me. The system had simply started asking questions of its own. Truth had not arrived like lightning. It arrived the way dawn always does, slowly enough that almost nobody notices the darkness fading. The difference between Julian and me became easier to see. The more uncertain the company became, the more restless he appeared. His voice grew sharper during meetings. Small mistakes provoked disproportionate frustration. He interrupted people more often, corrected details that didn't matter, demanded updates that changed nothing. One afternoon, I watched him criticize a junior analyst over a formatting error that required less than 30 seconds to fix. The room became painfully quiet. After the meeting ended, the analyst remained behind, staring silently at his laptop. I walked over. "You did good work." He looked surprised. It didn't seem like it. "A formatting mistake isn't the same as poor work." He nodded without saying anything else. I returned to my desk. The conversation lasted less than a minute. I forgot about it almost immediately. The analyst didn't. 2 days later, I found a corrected financial report already waiting on my desk before I arrived. Attached to it was a small handwritten note. "I thought you should have the accurate version." No signature. There didn't need to be one. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was simply the first quiet act of courage. Someone had decided that accuracy mattered more than fear. I folded the note and placed it inside my notebook. Not because it proved I was right, because it reminded me that integrity rarely travels alone forever. Someone always notices. Eventually, someone follows. The weeks that followed brought another small surprise. A production supervisor quietly corrected an inaccurate statement during a meeting. Not dramatically, not confrontationally. He simply said, "Actually, that's not what happened." The room fell silent. No one argued. The conversation moved on. A few days later, another employee volunteered additional documentation before anyone requested it. Then someone else began copying more departments into project emails. Small actions, ordinary decisions. Yet together, they formed something I hadn't seen in a long time. Courage. Not loud courage, not heroic courage. Just ordinary people choosing honesty in moments where dishonesty would have been easier. I never asked any of them to defend me. I never gathered supporters. I never tried to expose Julian. There was no campaign, no speeches, no strategy, only consistency. Looking back, I realized something I had completely misunderstood. I had spent months believing integrity changes organizations by defeating corrupt people. It doesn't. Integrity changes organizations by quietly giving ordinary people permission to become honest again. One Monday morning, I arrived at work before sunrise, just as I always had. The security guard at the entrance smiled. "Morning, Mr. Carter?" "Morning." He hesitated. "You always seem to be the first one here." I smiled. "Someone has to unlock the day." He laughed. It was a simple exchange. Months earlier, I would have walked inside thinking about my damaged reputation, about promotions, about meetings, about Julian. Instead, I simply enjoyed the conversation. As I rode the elevator upward, I caught my reflection in the polished metal doors. The face looking back at me appeared older, more tired. There were lines beneath my eyes that hadn't existed a year before. But there was something else I hadn't seen in a very long time. Peace. Not because life had become fair. It hadn't. Not because justice had arrived. It hadn't. Not because people suddenly trusted me again. Many still didn't. The peace came from somewhere deeper. I no longer entered the office trying to convince anyone that I was a good man. I entered because I had already decided what kind of man I would be. That decision no longer depended on promotions, or recognition, or reputation. Julian continued escalating. His frustration became more visible with every passing week. Mine quietly disappeared. For the first time, he looked like the man fighting to protect himself, and I looked like the man who no longer needed to. The circumstances around us had barely changed, but the direction of the story had. Without anyone announcing it, without anyone even recognizing it, the balance had begun to shift. Not because corruption had become weaker, but because it could no longer control the one thing it had spent months trying to destroy. The man living according to his own conscience. The rumors never completely disappeared. They simply stopped reaching me. Not because people had stopped talking, because I had stopped letting their opinions decide how I carried myself. Each morning, I arrived before sunrise, greeted the security guards, reviewed the day's priorities, and began working exactly as I always had. When someone questioned my decisions, I answered respectfully. When someone ignored my suggestions, I accepted it without resentment. When another rumor drifted through the office, I no longer wasted energy chasing it down. Several coworkers began noticing. One afternoon, a junior analyst approached my desk after a meeting. "I don't understand something." I looked up. "What is it?" They keep saying all these things about you. He hesitated. But you never seem angry. I smiled. I've been angry. Then why don't you show it? Because my anger wouldn't solve the problem. He thought about that for a moment. I don't think I could do that. I laughed softly. Neither could I. Not a year ago. The conversation ended there. I returned to my reports. The analyst remained standing for another second before quietly walking away. Across the office, two employees who had overheard the exchange exchanged puzzled glances. For months, Julian's strategy had depended on provoking me into becoming the man his rumors described. The longer I refused to become that man, the less believable those rumors quietly became. Without realizing it, I had become impossible to provoke. Arthur's questions began changing. Instead of asking, "What are people saying?" he started asking, "What actually happened?" The difference seemed small. It wasn't. One Monday morning, he requested documentation for a project that had been criticized weeks earlier. His executive assistant returned with the complete file, every approval, every timeline, every email. Arthur spent nearly an hour reading it alone. Something didn't fit. The delays everyone had blamed on me had actually originated elsewhere. That afternoon, another report landed on his desk. Different project, different department. The same pattern. Complaints had spread quickly. Evidence had moved slowly. For the first time, Arthur called managers into his office individually instead of together. He asked simple questions. When did this happen? Who witnessed it? Where is the documentation? Some answers came immediately. Others didn't. Several managers who had spoken confidently during meetings suddenly became noticeably uncertain when asked for specifics. Julian noticed. After one executive review, he caught Arthur outside the boardroom. "You're spending an unusual amount of time reviewing old issues." Arthur looked at him calmly. "I'm reviewing decisions." "I thought those matters were already settled." "So did I." Arthur continued walking. Julian remained standing in the hallway, watching him disappear around the corner. For the first time, he wasn't entirely sure the story he had carefully built was still being believed. The company itself began remembering. Not because someone organized an investigation, because people started connecting moments they had never connected before. A procurement officer remembered that one of my recommendations had been rejected, only to be implemented months later under someone else's name. An operations supervisor quietly mentioned that the production delays blamed on my department had actually started before I was ever assigned to the project. An IT technician recalled the unexplained access logs from nearly a year earlier. "I always thought that was strange," he admitted during a conversation with another employee. "So did I." One memory led to another. No one gathered in secret. No one planned a rebellion. People simply began talking honestly. Each conversation was small. Each memory seemed insignificant. Yet together, they formed something impossible to ignore. Patterns. The culture of silence had depended on everyone believing they were the only person who noticed something was wrong. Now they were discovering they had never been alone. Truth wasn't arriving because someone exposed corruption. Truth was arriving because dozens of ordinary people finally realized their individual observations belonged to the same story. Julian noticed the change before anyone else. People still obeyed him, but they no longer responded with the same confidence. Questions lingered longer during meetings. Managers requested written confirmation more often. Employees who once accepted instructions without hesitation now quietly asked for clarification. It irritated him. At first, he concealed it. Then, the cracks began showing. A scheduling coordinator asked whether a deadline should be revised to match updated production forecasts. Instead of answering calmly, Julian snapped, "Do I have to explain every obvious decision?" The room fell silent. The coordinator apologized, even though the question had been reasonable. After the meeting, two managers exchanged uneasy looks. That seemed unnecessary. He wasn't like that before. The comments were whispered, but they existed, and once people begin noticing behavior, they rarely stop. Julian became increasingly impatient. He interrupted presentations before they were finished, dismissed concerns without listening, demanded immediate results from problems that required careful planning. Ironically, the harder he tried to maintain control, the more obvious it became that control was slipping away. Meanwhile, I continued working exactly as I always had. I wasn't trying to defeat him. I wasn't even thinking about defeating him anymore. I simply completed my work, treated people with respect, and went home to Claire each evening with a peace I hadn't known in years. Some battles end long before anyone realizes they've already been won. Julian still believed he was fighting me. He failed to see that he had quietly begun fighting himself. The first person to speak publicly wasn't one of the executives. It wasn't a department head. It wasn't someone with influence. It was a senior production supervisor named Daniel. During the weekly operations meeting, Julian criticized a delay in one of the manufacturing schedules. The planning team failed to communicate the revision on time. Daniel looked down at the report in front of him. For a moment, it seemed as though he would remain silent, like everyone else always had. Instead, he quietly raised his hand. "I don't believe that's accurate." The room became still. Julian looked at him. "What do you mean?" Daniel opened a folder. The planning team sent the revised schedule 2 days before production. He slid printed emails across the table. The delay happened because our department approved the change late. No one spoke. Not because Daniel had embarrassed anyone, because he had done something almost no one had dared to do for months. He had corrected the record, calmly, respectfully, without attacking anyone. Julian glanced at the emails before forcing a smile. "I see. We'll review it." The meeting moved forward, yet nothing about the room felt the same afterward. As people gathered their documents, another manager quietly approached Daniel. "Thank you." Daniel shrugged. "I just didn't think the wrong team should carry the blame." It was a simple sentence, but something shifted inside the company. Truth had finally spoken out loud. The following week, similar moments began appearing across different departments. A finance manager corrected an inaccurate budget summary before it reached the executive office. An HR coordinator insisted that employee feedback be attached in full instead of summarized. An operations engineer volunteered additional maintenance records after realizing important details had been omitted. None of them announced themselves as acts of courage. To the people doing them, they simply felt like the right thing to do, yet everyone noticed. Employees who had spent months watching each other in silence slowly rediscovered something they had forgotten. Honesty becomes easier once someone else has shown it, can survive. I never organized these moments. In fact, I often learned about them only after they had already happened. One afternoon, the junior analyst who had spoken to me weeks earlier stopped beside my desk. "I think people are changing." I smiled. "I think they're remembering." He frowned thoughtfully. "Remembering what?" "Who they wanted to be before they became afraid." He nodded slowly. "I never thought about it like that." Neither had I. Not until now. Integrity had never asked people to become heroes. It had only invited them to stop pretending. Arthur noticed the difference before the quarterly leadership review. The atmosphere inside the company still carried tension, but it was no longer one-sided. Reports arriving on his desk had become more complete. Supporting documents appeared without being requested. Managers who once repeated rumors now referenced timelines and evidence. Most importantly, the same conclusion kept emerging from different places. Not because employees had coordinated their stories, because the facts themselves refused to stay hidden. Late one evening, Arthur remained alone in his office. Spread across his desk were dozens of documents from the previous year: performance evaluations, project approvals, meeting minutes, budget revisions, email records. He wasn't looking for one mistake anymore. He was looking for a pattern. Slowly, it emerged. Projects delayed after changing ownership. Recommendations rejected before later being implemented under different names. Complaints unsupported by measurable results. Repeated criticism directed toward the same employee. Despite consistently positive performance data, Arthur leaned back in his chair. For months he had examined every incident separately. Viewed individually, each one seemed explainable. Viewed together, they became undeniable. He removed his glasses and closed his eyes. His disappointment wasn't directed toward poor performance. It was directed toward something far worse. A culture that had slowly learned to reward perception over truth. He whispered quietly to himself, "How did I let this happen?" There was no immediate answer, only silence and responsibility. The following Monday felt strangely ordinary. People arrived, coffee brewed, computers started, meetings filled the calendar. Nothing dramatic happened. Yet I sensed something different. Employees greeted me more naturally. Conversations no longer stopped the moment I approached. A procurement manager waved me over to ask for my opinion on a scheduling issue. 2 engineers invited me to join them for lunch without hesitation. Small moments, easy to overlook. Months earlier, I would have celebrated every one of them. Now, I simply accepted them with gratitude, because they were never the goal. Respect that depends on circumstances disappears with circumstances. Respect, rooted in character, returns when people are ready to see clearly. That distinction changed everything. As I walked through the production floor later that afternoon, I watched employees solving problems together, laughing occasionally, disagreeing respectfully. It wasn't perfect. The company still had deep wounds. Julian still possessed authority. No formal investigation had begun. No public apology had been offered. Justice had not yet arrived. But trust was quietly returning. Not because anyone ordered it, because enough ordinary people had chosen truth at the same time. When I reached my desk, I paused for a moment before beginning the day's work. Almost a year. Earlier, I had walked into this building hoping to prove that integrity could survive corruption. Now I understood something even more important. Integrity doesn't merely survive. Given enough time, it teaches others how to stand again. I opened the first project folder of the day and smiled to myself. Not with triumph, not with relief, with quiet certainty. The tide had already turned. The current was still slow enough that many people couldn't see it. But I could feel it. And somewhere else inside the building, so could the man who had spent the past year trying to stop it. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning. Subject: Internal Operations Review. It was addressed to every department manager. Arthur Whitmore had requested a formal review of several operational decisions made over the previous 18 months. The message was brief, professional, without accusation. Yet the entire building seemed to breathe differently after reading it. People stopped speculating. They started searching. Archived emails were reopened. Old project folders returned to conference tables. Approval records that had gathered dust inside filing cabinets were suddenly being requested again. No one announced an investigation. Arthur simply asked for documentation. And somehow, that was enough. For months, I had lived as though every conversation required me to defend myself. Now no one asked for my defense. They asked for records, timelines, evidence. The burden had quietly shifted. Truth no longer depended on my memory. It depended on the company's own history. Later that afternoon, Arthur invited me into the executive conference room. Only the two of us were there. A stack of project binders rested neatly in front of him. "I'll need your cooperation." "You have it." "I want facts." "You'll get facts." "No assumptions." "I don't have any." Arthur looked at me for a long moment. Months earlier, I would have interpreted his silence as uncertainty. Now I recognize something else. Humility. A leader trying to correct mistakes before making new ones. He opened the first binder. "Walk me through this project." I did. Not once did I mention Julian. Not once did I describe myself as a victim. I explained the original objectives, the timeline, the approvals, the documented delays. Every statement ended the same way. "The documentation is attached." Arthur asked another question, then another. Each answer pointed toward evidence instead of emotion. After nearly 2 hours, he quietly closed the final folder. "You've never asked me to punish anyone." "No." "You've never demanded your position back." "No." "Why?" I smiled faintly. "Because neither of those things would prove the truth." He lowered his eyes toward the folders. For the first time in nearly a year, he wasn't trying to determine whether I was telling the truth. He was trying to understand why he had waited so long to ask. The review expanded throughout the company. Every department received the same request: provide documentation, explain timelines, identify who approved major operational decisions. Almost immediately, small inconsistencies began finding each other. A purchasing manager discovered that one project had been delayed 3 weeks before my department ever became involved. An HR administrator noticed complaints that had been formally recorded months after the events they supposedly described. The IT department recovered archived server logs showing unauthorized access to project files on the same evenings. Critical documents had mysteriously disappeared. Each discovery seemed minor by itself. No single document proved corruption, but none of them stood alone anymore. Like pieces scattered across different puzzles, they suddenly began fitting together. One afternoon, Arthur called several department heads into a review session. No speeches, no accusations. He simply projected a timeline onto the conference room screen. Project approvals, leadership changes, budget revisions, anonymous complaints, operational delays. Every event appeared exactly where it belonged. Silence slowly settled over the room. Not because the timeline contained dramatic revelations, because it removed the illusion that everything had happened by chance. A logistics manager spoke first. "I remember that meeting." Another nodded. "So do I." A finance supervisor pointed toward one of the dates. "That's when we were told the delay came from Ethan's team." She paused. It didn't. No one argued. Because another manager quietly added, "We had the emails." Someone else opened an archived folder. The timestamps match. Every answer produced another question. Every question uncovered another connection. The truth was no longer asking people to trust one man's character. It was asking them to explain the evidence sitting in front of them. Julian noticed the shift almost immediately. Managers who once accepted his explanations without hesitation now asked for supporting documentation. Routine approvals suddenly required written justification. Arthur requested weekly operational summaries instead of verbal updates. Control was slipping away, one ordinary question at a time. Julian refused to believe it. "They're overreacting," he muttered after one leadership meeting. "They're wasting time digging through old paperwork." But the paperwork refused to stay buried. Each day uncovered another inconsistency. Each inconsistency pointed toward another decision. The more Julian tried to explain them individually, the more obvious the larger pattern became. His frustration became increasingly visible. During one executive review, a department manager politely asked whether an approval date should be corrected to match the archived records. Julian answered before the question had even finished. "It doesn't matter." Arthur looked up. "It matters if the record is inaccurate." Julian forced a smile. "It's a clerical issue." Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he made a note beside the document. "We'll verify it." The meeting continued, but Julian's composure didn't. Later that evening, he remained alone inside his office long after everyone else had gone home. He opened old emails, deleted folders, approval histories, searching desperately for something that would restore the story he had spent years constructing. The harder he searched, the more inconsistencies he found. For the first time since this began, Julian wasn't trying to manage the company. He was trying to outrun the consequences of his own decisions. And with every frantic attempt to regain control, he left behind another trail that would become impossible to ignore. The first person to speak wasn't the loudest. It was the quietest. Arthur had invited representatives from every department into the largest conference room in the building. Not for a trial, not for a confrontation, for a review. The atmosphere felt strangely different from every meeting we had endured during the previous year. Nobody arrived trying to win an argument. They arrived carrying folders, evidence, memories, truth. Arthur stood at the front of the room. "I've spent the past several weeks reviewing documents." He looked around slowly. "I've also learned that documents rarely tell the whole story." He paused. "So today, I'd like to hear from the people who lived it." Silence. Not fearful silence. Uncertain silence. Arthur spoke again. "No one is here to attack anyone. If you remember something relevant, simply tell us what happened." For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then Daniel, the senior production supervisor, slowly stood. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't dramatic. "I need to correct something." Every eye turned toward him. "Last year, when Ethan's department was blamed for delaying production, he opened a folder. It wasn't true." He pointed toward the production logs. "Our department approved the revised schedule 4 days late. We knew it. We just never corrected the record." The room remained completely still. Daniel swallowed. "I should have said something sooner." Arthur nodded. "Thank you." Nothing more. No applause, no criticism, just gratitude. Then another chair moved. The finance supervisor stood. "I'd like to add something." She explained how budget revisions had repeatedly been attributed to Ethan's planning decisions, despite financial records showing otherwise. Then the HR coordinator spoke. Then the procurement manager. Then the IT administrator. Each testimony was ordinary. None of them sounded heroic. Each person simply described what they had personally witnessed. No speculation, no assumptions, no revenge. Individually, their stories explained very little. Together, they explained everything. Months of confusion suddenly became one coherent picture. No single employee had seen the entire truth. But together, they had lived every piece of it. The culture of fear didn't collapse because someone found the perfect evidence. It collapsed because ordinary people finally realized honesty was no longer something they had to practice alone. By the end of the meeting, no one was looking at me anymore. That surprised me. For nearly 2 years, every important conversation inside the company had somehow revolved around me. Now, the discussion had become much larger. It wasn't about Ethan Carter. It was about the kind of company everyone had unknowingly allowed themselves to become. Arthur quietly closed the final folder. "I think we've heard enough." Nobody disagreed. He dismissed everyone except the executive leadership team. As employees slowly left the room, several people stopped beside me. Not to apologize, not to congratulate me, simply to shake my hand. The junior analyst smiled awkwardly. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I." Daniel extended his hand next. "I should have spoken sooner." I shook it firmly. "You spoke when you were ready." He lowered his eyes. "I still wish it had been earlier." "So do I. But today matters." He nodded. "It does." Watching them walk away, I realized something. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It simply refuses to let the past become the only thing that exists between people. Later that afternoon, Arthur requested one final executive meeting. Only a handful of people remained. Arthur, Julian, the board representatives, legal counsel, and me. Arthur spoke without raising his voice. "For months, I believed perception more than evidence. That mistake belongs to me." No one interrupted. "I've now reviewed every available record, interviewed every department, and compared every decision against documented facts." He looked directly at Julian. "The pattern is clear." Julian leaned forward immediately. "This is political." "No," Arthur answered calmly. "It's documented." Julian's composure cracked. "They're rewriting history." Arthur slowly pushed several binders across the table. "No, they're preserving it." Julian opened one binder, then another. Emails, approval logs, financial records, server access histories, meeting minutes. Every attempt to defend himself required explaining another contradiction. Every explanation created another question. His voice grew louder. "They're all protecting him." Arthur remained still. "No. They're protecting the truth." Julian stood abruptly. "This company would have collapsed without me." No one answered. He looked around the room, searching for support. The board members remained silent. Legal counsel remained silent. Department leaders remained silent. For the first time in his career, authority could no longer manufacture agreement. He looked toward me, as though hoping I would finally argue, finally accuse him, finally become the angry man he had spent years describing. I simply met his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing left to prove. His greatest defeat no longer required my participation. Arthur slowly stood. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of your executive responsibilities pending final board action." The sentence was spoken without triumph, without anger, only responsibility. Julian stared at him, then at the room, then back at me. Power had abandoned him long before the words were spoken. Only now, he finally understood it. News spread through the building before the meeting had officially ended. Employees didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no gossip-filled victory laps, only a quiet sense that something heavy had finally been lifted. Late that afternoon, Arthur asked me to join him in the company auditorium. Nearly every employee had gathered there. He stepped onto the stage alone. "I owe this company an apology." The room became completely silent. I failed to protect the culture we claimed to believe in. I confused confidence with integrity. I accepted assumptions where I should have demanded evidence. He paused before continuing. That failure belongs to me. No leader had ever spoken that honestly inside those walls. Then Arthur looked toward me. Ethan, would you join me? I walked slowly to the stage. The applause that greeted me wasn't loud. It was long. Not the applause reserved for heroes. The applause reserved for someone who had quietly carried a burden everyone else now understood. Arthur extended his hand. I once believed leadership belonged to the loudest voice. He smiled faintly. You reminded me it belongs to the strongest character. I shook his hand. Thank you. Nothing more. No speech, no celebration, no revenge, because the greatest reward had never been standing on that stage. It had happened months earlier, on a quiet morning, when I decided that my integrity would no longer depend on whether anyone believed in it. Everything that followed was simply the world catching up to a decision that had already changed my life. As I looked across the audience, I saw Claire standing quietly near the back, beside several employees' families. Our eyes met. She smiled, not because I had finally been proven right, but because she recognized the same man she had believed in when no one else did. That was the victory, not the promotion, not the recognition, not even justice. The real victory was that corruption had taken almost everything from me, except the one thing it had wanted most, who I chose to become. The first change wasn't announced. There was no company-wide celebration, no banners, no speeches about a new beginning. The company simply began making different decisions. Arthur understood something that many leaders never do. Removing one dishonest person would never be enough. If the system remained the same, someone else would eventually repeat the same mistakes. So instead of rebuilding reputations, he began rebuilding processes. Every major operational decision now required documented justification. Anonymous complaints could no longer influence promotions without supporting evidence. Project ownership became transparent. Cross-department approvals required multiple signatures instead of private conversations. Performance reviews shifted away from popularity and toward measurable contribution. Managers questioned data before they questioned people. The changes felt almost boring, which was exactly why they mattered. Healthy organizations rarely become healthy through dramatic moments. They become healthy through ordinary habits, repeated consistently. One afternoon, Arthur invited the executive team together. I don't want us remembering what happened here. Several managers looked confused. I want us remembering why it happened. He placed a binder labeled Operational Integrity Standards on the conference table. If we build a company that depends on good people, he continued, one bad leader can destroy it. He looked around the room. But if we build good systems, even imperfect people will be reminded to do the right thing. Nobody applauded. They simply opened the binders. The rebuilding had already begun. Justice mattered. But preventing the next injustice mattered even more. The changes inside the office slowly reached everyday life. People began knocking on my door more often, not because they had to, because they wanted advice. A project manager stopped by one morning. Could you look over this proposal? An engineer later asked, how would you handle this disagreement? The junior analyst who had once asked why I never became angry now visited almost every Friday afternoon. Sometimes we discussed production schedules, sometimes leadership, sometimes nothing related to work at all. One day he laughed awkwardly. You know, I don't actually come here because I need help anymore. No? I just leave calmer than when I walked in. I smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. It is. What surprised me most wasn't that people respected me. It was that they never treated me like someone important. They treated me like someone safe. Safe to ask questions, safe to admit mistakes, safe to disagree with. Months earlier, I would have considered influence something connected to authority. Now, I understood better. Authority can make people listen. Character makes them return. One afternoon, Arthur quietly observed several employees gathered around my desk, discussing a difficult production issue. No one had assigned me to lead the conversation. I wasn't giving orders. I was simply asking questions until everyone found the answer together. Arthur smiled to himself before continuing down the hallway. Leadership had finally appeared where titles no longer mattered. That evening, Claire and I ate dinner on our small apartment balcony. Nothing about the meal was extraordinary. Rice, grilled fish, vegetables. The same inexpensive dinner we had shared dozens of times before. Only this evening felt different. There was no invisible weight sitting between us. No unspoken fears. No rehearsed optimism pretending tomorrow would somehow fix everything. The silence felt comfortable again. Claire poured tea into my cup. "You smile more now." "Do I? You don't notice?" I thought about it. Maybe. She looked at me for a long moment. "You know, I used to think you were protecting your job." I raised an eyebrow. "So did I." She smiled softly. "But now I realize you weren't protecting your position. You were protecting yourself." I looked at her, confused. "The real you." She reached across the table and gently held my hand. "If you had become bitter, if you had become dishonest, if you had started treating people the way they treated you, you might have kept your position." She shook her head. "But I would have lost the man I married." Neither of us spoke for several moments. The evening breeze drifted gently across the balcony. Below us, children laughed somewhere in the neighborhood. Motorcycles passed along the street. Life continued quietly. "I kept asking God to fix your circumstances," Claire whispered. "I didn't realize. He was protecting your character." I squeezed her hand. "I think he was protecting both of us." For months we had survived together. Tonight, we finally felt like we were living again. There was no luxury, no sudden wealth, no dramatic reward, only peace. And after everything we had endured, peace felt priceless. Several weeks later, Arthur invited me to lunch. Not in the executive dining room, not during a board meeting. Just the two of us at a small restaurant a few blocks from the office. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things. Production forecasts, market conditions, the company's hiring plans. Eventually, Arthur set his fork down. "I'm getting older." I smiled. "We all are." He laughed. "I used to believe succession meant choosing the right person." He looked out the restaurant window. "I was wrong." "What changed?" "I realized the right person eventually leaves. The right system stays." I understood immediately. He wasn't talking only about leadership, he was talking about legacy. "When I founded this company," he continued, "I wanted to build something successful." He paused. "Now I want to leave behind something worthy." He explained the reforms already underway. Independent ethics reviews, transparent promotion standards, cross-functional hiring panels, leadership training centered on accountability rather than influence. "No family member," he said quietly, "including my own, will ever receive responsibility simply because of their name." His voice carried no bitterness, only conviction. I learned that lesson too late. "You learned it." He looked at me. "Because someone refused to compromise long enough for me to see it." I shook my head. "You saw it because you chose to." Arthur smiled. "Maybe. but someone still had to keep the light on while I was walking in the dark. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalk, unaware that inside the small restaurant, two men were discussing something far larger than business, a company's future, not measured by quarterly profits, but by the values it would still recognize long after both of them were gone. Months passed, then a year. The company slowly became known for something it had never been known for before. Not profits, not innovation, not rapid growth. People talked about something much quieter: trust. New employees often asked the same question during orientation. Why is everyone here so careful about documenting decisions? One of the senior managers would usually smile. Because we learned what happens when truth depends on memory. Another new employee might ask, why do managers spend so much time listening before making decisions? Someone else would answer, because assumptions almost destroyed this company. Over time, stories began replacing policies. The senior production supervisor would tell new hires about a manager who accepted blame without attacking anyone in return. The HR director would explain why anonymous accusations were never accepted without evidence. The finance department shared examples of projects that succeeded because people chose transparency over convenience. Interestingly, my name appeared less and less often. At first, I wondered why. Then I understood. The story had stopped belonging to me. It had become part of the company's character. One afternoon, I walked past a training room and overheard a leadership workshop. The instructor asked, "What is integrity?" Several answers filled the room. It's honesty. It's doing the right thing. It's accountability. The instructor smiled. Those are all true. But let me tell you a story. I didn't stay to listen. I already knew the ending. Some stories become most powerful when someone else chooses to tell them. A few weeks later, Arthur asked me to stop by his office one final time. The office looked different. The shelves held fewer awards. The frame photographs had changed. Pictures of company anniversaries had been replaced by photographs of employees working together on factory floors and project sites. Arthur noticed me looking. I realized something. What's that? I spent too many years displaying accomplishments. He smiled. I should have displayed people. I sat down across from him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Arthur quietly slid a small wooden box across his desk. Inside was the company's very first employee identification badge. Worn, faded, its edges softened by time. I carried this when there were only 6 of us. I looked at it carefully. It reminds me, Arthur said, that companies begin with dreams. He looked toward the factory outside his window. But they survive because ordinary people keep choosing principles after the dream becomes difficult. He closed the box. I wanted you to have it. I immediately shook my head. I can't. You should. No. I smiled. It belongs here. Arthur looked at me curiously. If you give it to me, it becomes a souvenir. If you leave it in this company, it remains a reminder. For several seconds, he simply looked at me. Then he laughed quietly. I suppose I still have something to learn. We all do. He placed the box back inside his desk. Thank you. What for? For reminding me that leadership isn't about leaving your name behind. It's about leaving behind something worth following. As I stood to leave, Arthur called my name one last time. Ethan. I turned. I've thanked you for helping save this company. Yes, that wasn't completely accurate. I waited. You didn't save the company. You reminded us what it was supposed to become. There was nothing left to add. Some gratitude is too large for words. I simply nodded and quietly walked out. A few days later, work ended like every other ordinary Friday. Computers powered down. Lights gradually switched off across the offices. Employees laughed as they gathered their bags. Someone wished another person a good weekend. The security guard waved as people left through the front entrance. I walked outside carrying the same worn leather bag I had brought with me on my very first day. The building stood behind me, glowing softly beneath the evening sky. There was a time when merely looking at those walls reminded me of humiliation, of false accusations, of lonely lunches, of sleepless nights. Now, they reminded me of something entirely different: growth. Not because the building had changed, because I had. I stood there for a moment, watching employees leave one by one. Some waved goodbye, others smiled. One young engineer jogged across the parking lot. "Have a good weekend, Ethan." "You too." He hurried toward his car. I looked back at the building one final time. Then I smiled. Not because I had defeated Julian. Months earlier, I had already stopped measuring life that way. Not because I had received recognition. Recognition fades. Not because justice had finally arrived. Justice, too, belongs to moments. I smiled because I suddenly understood something that had taken me years to learn. No humiliation had changed me. No manipulation had rewritten me. No corruption had successfully convinced me to become someone I would later be ashamed to remember. The only victories that truly last are the ones no one else can take away. I turned and began walking toward the parking lot, where Claire waited beside our old car. She rolled down the window. "You ready?" I smiled. "I've been ready for a while." She laughed. "So, how was work?" I looked once more toward the building before getting into the car. It was... I paused, searching for the right word. "Ordinary." Claire smiled. "I think that's exactly what you've always wanted." "It is." I closed the door. The engine started. The company slowly disappeared behind us as we drove toward home. Toward an ordinary evening. Toward an ordinary life. And somehow, that ordinary life had become the greatest reward I could have imagined. Because in the end, power can control positions. Fear can control silence. Money can influence decisions. But none of them can control a person who has already decided who they are. That was the final laugh.